the recording going, and let me pull up my presentation here. All right, I see there's something in the chat already. For some reason, it logged me. I'm on my son's name. This is actually Holly Dex. Well, welcome, Holly. That's okay. We will get started. All right, let me present here. So I'm Lauren Kelley. If you haven't joined me before, welcome. Nice to see you, meet you in this virtual setting. If we've met before, thanks for coming and joining again. So today we're talking about some advanced cataloging, basically to get you kind of more comfortable with the idea of doing some original cataloging, perhaps, building off of what we talked about last week, which I will get into. We'll review some of the basic MARC fields that we get into in the kind of basic cataloging course and also last week, which the recording is available on Niche Academy. So we'll also get into MARC fields that aren't talked about quite as often. But here first are kind of the bread and butter basic cataloging fields that we always talk about. So last week we talked about the 020 field for ISBNs, the 040 for your institution or consortium code, especially important if you're making any kind of edits to a record. We talked about the 100 or the 110 for an author. The 245 field is where your title goes. 264 for publication and copyright data. 300 physical description, and then those RDA fields that talk about content type, media type, carrier type, and then 520 is where your summary goes, and 650. Having 3 of those makes a good record for your subject headings. And next week, we'll be diving even more into subject headings and talking about controlled vocabulary. So if that's something that you're interested in, we'll go into some history, which has been fascinating for me to find out about. So that'll be next week at the same time if you're interested in that. And then last week, we also talked about the 700 and 710 field for contributors and editors. We went over the fact that MARC stands for Machine Readable Cataloging Record. It's really the framework. So these fields that I've just listed, where data goes, it's really the framework so that a computer is able to read it. So it's easier shared and living in this digital age with us. RDA, though, is what data elements of the item should be presented. So RDA is the what, and the MARC is the where. An important factor while we're thinking about these things of, why do we need these rules? Why do we need these standards? There's this concept of bibliocide by cataloging, which Sanford Berman kind of coined that term, and we'll talk about his work next week. But it's making sure that people can find and access what they need, what they're after. That's really the point of good cataloging. And of course, I will mention ILS a lot today, your integrated library system, especially today. But when it comes to copy cataloging as well, you got to know how your ILS works. And while I'm always happy to consult with cataloging issues, my knowledge of your ILS might not be, I might not have all that much experience with your specific ILS, but I'm always happy to try and point out resources. All right, there is a question. Will next week use the same link for the meeting? Yes, we are using the same link. Bree is asking, looks like Teams has updated. Where's the rename feature now? That is a good question. I would think under the 3 little dots that say more, possibly in your settings. I'm not sure. That's a good question. Sure we can get back to that at some point. Yeah, let me find out and I'll reach out about that. Okay, so we do have a lot to cover cataloging wise today. We're going to go through a bunch of fields. And last week, I think I said that about 20% of MARC record fields are used in basically every record, where the other 80% are rarely used. But today, we're really focusing and diving into some of that 80%. So we're going to talk about 001 and 003 for control number and identifier. We're going to talk about 005, last seen. We're going to talk about physical description, fixed length data elements. We're going to talk about the Library of Congress control number or the system control number. We will mention again the cataloging source, kind of broadening out what the whole field is. And we'll talk about language codes. 246 is for varying form of title. 250 is for the edition. 490 and 830 all have to do with series. If a book comes in a series, tagging that. 500 for your general notes. 505 for your contents. 600 and 610 for personal name or a corporate name, 651 for geographic heading, and 655 for genre. Those 600 fields might be a little redundant if you were in the certificate program class that we did in August, but worth going over. All right, so a general note about when you see brackets in records. Basically, catalogers use the brackets to indicate data that was added at the cataloger's discretion. It may not be directly from the item, it may not be printed on the physical item, but it is in good faith with good assurance and authority that this data that was added in the brackets is relevant and accurate to the item in hand. There could be a variety of reasons why brackets would show up, but it basically means that there's good authority that this data is correct and accurate to the material, even if it wasn't stated on the edition or whatever, but by a cataloger. So with abbreviations, I also wanted to mention that you should definitely transcribe what you see, because we always go from item to the MARC record. You always base what goes into your MARC record on a physical material in hand. So you really want to transcribe what you see. But if there are abbreviations appearing on the source, transcribe it that way. But in general, don't abbreviate, abridge, or use initialisms. Before, when we were talking about previous rules like AACR2 for cataloging, there was less computer space really for data, but we don't face that as much anymore. So you should really feel free to, if something's an addition, you can write addition instead of ED. There is a question already saying, I often see brackets around publication dates even when they appear in a book. Is there a reason for this? So there could be multiple reasons. I think probably the most common is just that there might be some uncertainty about whether the publication date is the publication date or the copyright date, but you know that you can attribute that date to the item, so it's worth including on the record. That's what I would think initially if I see a date in brackets, that there is good authority that this date can come directly off of the item, but may not be explicitly stated. But like I said, there could be a variety of reasons. If it is clearly marked that that is the publication date, you could probably in good authority take away the brackets, but you generally want to operate that there was a reason why it was bracketed. But also, once again, that's kind of the judgment call that a lot of cataloging comes down to. So if it's present, really doesn't need brackets. There could be a reason why. It could have been that the record was made perhaps before the book was actually published, so they knew that it was going to be published. That's why the brackets appeared there. Could be a variety of reasons. There are many examples of every element, and we'll see that as we go through our slides today in the MARC 21 handbook, which is all linked at the bottom of every slide. It's really the go-to one-stop shop for examples, but they also do have an example of a full record, which is very helpful to look at. A lot of cataloging is comparison and saying, okay, what do they do there? Looking at examples and then applying them to your work. That's generally a good practice. So I thought I would include that there. All right, so getting into it. I want to state again the importance of knowing how your ILS functions, because the way that you can fill out fields is going to vary depending on what ILS you're using, what's presented to you, what automatically fills in. There are a lot of variables and a lot of variations between different ILS. But the leader is all about the record itself, and there are no indicators or subfields. There aren't any indicators or subfields for the leader. It is positionally defined, which it's not the only tag we'll get into today that is positionally defined. But what that means is there are 24 spaces that make up that leader field. Each space relates to a specific aspect of the record. So collections of spaces can also mean one element. Over here on the right, this is what the RDA book template looks like when you kind of do like a fast add template option for a MARC record in Verso, which is what the state uses. This is, once again, so that the computer can understand what the record is, where it came from, what the material is gets recorded here. So if we look at this example on the right here, we have type of record, that's position 6 out of the 24. And we're doing a book here in this example, so it's printed language material. It gets an A in that 6 slot. M is for a monograph item, which also appears there in that 07. So it comes after the A for printed material, M for monograph item. The next spaces aren't applicable to the item. And then we have an A here again for descriptive cataloging form, AACR2. So this is probably going to be a hybrid record having both AACR2 rules and some RDA elements. We can see here that there is content type and media type and carrier type. So this is kind of what comes up automatically with a template. Things are going to probably appear differently or be different. And there's probably settings in your ILS in which you can choose what your template automatically fills out. And then down here, there are links to more information about those fields. There is a question asking, could you define spaces? Is that characters or groups of characters? The short answer, unfortunately, is yes. So some spaces, when I say that, I'm trying to think of a better way to explain. So I think we could also use the word positions. There are 24 positions in a field, so, opportunities for characters. But it is true that some of those spaces take up multiple, some of those elements take up multiple spaces. Let's see, okay, so I do have an example here as well, but I don't have a good, okay, I guess maybe this helps. So the 0 space, so your starting space to your 4th space, this all has to do with the record length, which is not usually applicable for books. And then here you have your 5th space, like the 5th position in that field is going to be whether your record is corrected or revised. Your sixth space, which we can see is present here. So this C in this example, someone has asked, what does the N stand for in the last example? Because it's an original record. I guess it's potentially revised. I would have to pull up the rules here to look at that exactly, but it might show up as an N. I don't know off the top of my head. But here, this one is a C in that sixth or in that fifth position. So it's a corrected record. 6, the type of material A, I think that answered that question, is for the language. No, is pointing out that it is a language material. So it's really that saying that this is printed text. It's a book. It's pointing to the fact that this is a record for a book. And then the bibliographic level also reflects that it's not a print, it's not an ebook, it's a monograph item. There's something to hold. It's physical. And then 0 through 20 or 8 through 23, the rest of the positions are blank as the data does not apply, which is really, I mean, commonly you're going to see the descriptive cataloging form included. Typically your encoding level, position 17, is going to be, you know, you're fully addressing all the encoding. But your position 18 could change potentially on what kind of record and what kind of descriptive cataloging you're doing. But typically I mostly see A, that is a holdover from using AACR2 rules. Okay, this is a very funky, weird field that can appear in a lot of different ways. It's really good to look at the examples that are in the MARC 21 handbook. If you are in a position where your ILS is not coming up with a template already, but generally it's good practice to use the template. Laura, I see that you have put a statement into the chat box. This orientation to the 24 positions is very helpful. Oh, okay. I understand what you're saying. Good. I'm glad. Yeah, it's a little daunting when you really get into like this metadata almost of an item. But hopefully that helps. It's your leader may look a little different depending on what ILS you have. Hopefully you can use a general template in most cases. But if there's specific questions, please go to the MARC 21 handbook and that'll be your good guide. Okay, moving on to more kind of weird fields that don't have indicators or subfields. This typically contains the control number assigned by the organization creating, using, or distributing the record. This is typically OCLC, but may be system generated. So your ILS may take it upon itself to fill that out for you. So there are a couple of situations where how to proceed changes depending on if you have a shared catalog or not. Documentation of the structure of the control number and input conventions should be provided to exchange partners. So if you're in a shared catalog, of course, you need to make sure that what these fields that are being used are all agreed upon and understood. The MARC code identifying whose system control number is present in field 001 is contained in field 003. So part of this is that these fields work in tandem to say, okay, this is the control number. We want it to be clear and stated, but then we also want to state where that control number is coming from. We'll look at an example in a second here. So an organization receiving a record may move the incoming control number from field 001 and the control number identifier from 003 to 035, the system control number, 010, Library of Congress control number, or 016, National Bibliographic Agency control number as appropriate, and place its own system control number in field 001 and its control number identifier in field 003. All this is saying is that there are many of these initial fields that speak to a control number that's either system generated from the Library of Congress, from the OCLC, from the National Bibliographic Agency, that say this record, this item. That's basically the general gist of what these control numbers and identifiers are getting at, working on a specific item that can be recognized, this MARC record, as this item. Don't want us to get too worked up about these. Maybe I don't have a good example for this. There are examples in the MARC 21 handbook. I think generally you're going to see a lot of Library of Congress control number and system control numbers, which are going to show up in the 010, 035. Once again, there are no indicators, but there are subfields. So these are the first fields that we've talked about today that do have subfields. So they appear a little bit more like a typical MARC field. And this also applies to the last slide and the numbers presented there. These are unique numbers that are assigned to a MARC record by the Library of Congress. An organization using Library of Congress records may move that control number from 001, where it may appear, to field 010 and use 001 for its own system control number. There is a question, when is a control number helpful for us, or is it mostly used to match records, for instance, in merging items in Clover? That's a great question, Susan. I think that a lot of our ILS systems rely on the ISBN number for matching, but this is another way to match MARC records that is, unique on good authority. So I would say that it definitely comes in handy to match records. I don't think Clover uses it. I think Clover may use ISBN. But yeah, that's a good question. I think it probably could, but I think it probably uses ISBN. Yeah, there are more intricacies there, but generally just the system control number is stated here or in 001. Okay, here's an example. So this is a MARC record in WorldCat. I tried to get kind of a slew of different examples for us to look at because there's many ways we can interact with a MARC record. So our 001 control number in this case is here. And you'll see that it's different from what appears here in the 010, which is the Library of Congress control number. And our 003 is not stated, which I don't know if we can say on good authority. Oh, do you know what? This is the same item. So in this Verso ILS, it does state that this is in fact the OCLC number. So this is the OCLC number. And, typically you would want to include that 003 control number ID saying OCLC so that you don't do what I just did saying, okay, but where is that number coming from? On what authority is that being placed? But in Verso, it's stated here. So that's always helpful. Let's see here. There is a link here to talk more about this kind of metadata. So let's check the chat. We're doing okay. So 005 is another field that I think does not have indicators or subfields. And it's just saying when the item, or really when the mark, was last seen. And there is a specific format to how the date appears and how time appears. Fairly straightforward once you see it spelled out. Here's an example. We have our Verso MARC record. The year that it was created was 2017. The month was August. The day was the 11th at 11:24. And this is military time. Yeah, 24-hour clock is used to represent when this MARC record was created. And a lot of times this is a field that will auto-populate. Okay, moving on to 007, your physical description. And some of this information may seem redundant depending on, what information is present in the leader, as well as the 007. Once again, as I mentioned last week, that 80% of the fields don't show up in every record, and even the fields we go over today may not ever be present or are rarely present, but they can be very helpful. And especially for our fourth week of classes, we'll be talking about cataloging non-traditional items. So some of the fields from today are going to be extra important in that session, because if you have something that is, still a monograph / item, but it may be a map. There is a 007 code for maps and electronic resources, globes, tactile material, projected graphic, microform, non-projected graphic, motion picture, kit, notated music, remote sensing image, sound recording. Text is typically what we see for a book, video recording, or unspecified. Yeah, I won't get too much into this field today because it'll be extra important when we're talking about non-traditional materials. So typically for a book, you'll see TA if this field is present. But I also wanted to include that once again, this is I believe the term is, yeah, the tree structure. It's positionally defined, but the amount of characters or spaces or positions present might change depending on what the item is. So if you see here in this example, current contents, that's a lot of different characters that have filled out in comparison to the current contents for a book. Text, regular print. Pretty straightforward, but with a sound recording, there are a lot of different aspects to the physical description that can be accounted for. So if you look down here, these are all the different data elements, 13 positions worth in comparison to, really the 1, 2 that are there for a book. And each of these can change. So that's what we mean by branching, is that depending on, what you choose first, it's going to branch in different ways where your field is going to change shape and size depending on how much information is relevant to the physical description of that item. A very similar field to 007 is our 008, which is fixed length data elements. Once again, there are no indicators or subfield codes. And I will say, I haven't pointed out before, but most of these are non-repeatable. You're just going to have this one instance of this data pertaining to your item. And once again, this also has a tree structure. It's positionally defined. Typically, we're going to see books, but there's also computer files. Once again, maps is treated as its, separate thing. Music, continuing resource, so that would be like a serial or something you get on a regular basis. visual materials. That could be any kind of art or probably video would go under mixed materials. I've also seen computer files if someone's cataloging, like if they have something in Hoopla or something like that. A streaming video could be a computer file. Once again, that tree structure is going to make it so that depending on what you have, things will look different and the amount of data elements is going to change. So this is our example for a book. We have these first positions refer to the date. This is the date of the creation of the record, not the date of the item, because down here we have the type of date that's coming next. Typically with a book, there is a single known date or probable date, and that's just the copyright and publishing date. So these things come next to each other. They're tied to each other almost in a way, but there is a second, oops, sorry about that. There is a second grouping of positions that talk about a second year. So if your type of date is actually saying multiple dates, you can specify the copyright and the publication date if they're different. There's a space for that. There's a code for that. Your place, your publication location, there is, I think I've linked it somewhere here. There are MARC 21 codes for locations and also languages, which we'll get into. And then if there's illustrations present, you can make note of that. You can also get your target audience in this field in the 22 position. Form, you typically leave this blank because it is a book, but I think there are other options. Like I think there is a large print form in this 23 position. There's content. So if there's bibliographies, that could be present. Typically it's blank. If it's a government publication, which typically books we see are not. If it's a conference publication, it's again that, zeros and blanks are not interchangeable, but sometimes they work in the same way. Festschrifts, very rarely seen. That's typically left blank. This example is, typically what you're going to see if you have a book that is fictional. Literary form is noted. Also, if there's an index in the material, that goes in the 31 position. And once again, there's more biography elements. It's left blank. There's the language code there that gets a couple spaces to indicate. And I think when we talk about the other language field later, there are specific, 3 character codes that encapsulate that have been agreed upon. Modified record, typically blank. Cataloging source is typically other if you're doing original cataloging. In a lot of records that you probably download, or if you use records from OCLC, I think there's a specific code that is not D other. A lot of information, a lot of more granular aspects of the record that gets represented here in this fixed field. Talking about 040 again. Last week we kind of talked about how D, modifying record, subfield D in this field is really important because it notates, who's working on the record. The MARC code for, or the name of the organization that created, assigned MARC content, transcribed it, or modified it. That's what this field is all about. These data and the code specify the parties responsible for the bibliographic record. And there's no indicators here. So you'll typically see an A, a B, a C. D will be repeated as many times as needed. And then E. I see that a hand went up. Eric, would you like to hop in and ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question when it comes to the 040. And if you're like downloading a record, I've come across it sometimes where the A and the B fields are just not filled in.
That they're blank. Yeah.
And I've been curious what to do in that situation.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really good question. I think typically I wouldn't add anything because, I mean, if you don't know where the record originally stemmed from, if that information isn't present, it's probably not worth the time and effort to track it down where it did come from. But thankfully, because, you know, you can have, this kind of goes for any field, you can have blank information and just gaps in where things were not filled out properly. I have seen that before too, and it's always strange because it's like, someone created you. Whose are you? But I would just leave it blank. I mean, typically I do fill in the B because this is relating to the catalog itself, saying we're cataloging in English.
Sorry, I meant A and C. I forgot what the order was.
Yep. Yeah.
Super. All right, that was my instinct.
I just leave those blank. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good on you.
Thank you.
But if you do make any changes, definitely put your institution or consortium code into that D field. That's going to be really important. So that whoever next uses it isn't wondering who did some edits previously. And there is a link that can look up your institution code or consult with your consortium to make sure that you are doing the right conventions there.
Okay, can I ask one more question on that? I'm sorry.
Go for it. No problem.
Sometimes when I download records, it pops in with my institution code, but we are part of VOCAL or Green Mountain Library Consortium. I get confused. And that's typically what I have indicated is Green Mountain Library Consortium rather than the individual institution.
Yes. Yep. That's what I always did.
Take out our institution code if it autofills?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, that's a really good question about like what you should do. I have a better answer for what you can do, which is either really, because I think typically with the consortium, you do want to put the consortium code in. I think it's really up to you, but I would maybe consult with whoever your consortium cataloging kind of head is in terms of should I be deleting. Yeah, Jill Anderson says, I think the cataloging handbook from Vocal says to use GRMLC, which was always my finagling. I think, yeah, it's probably just better to take out your institution code and use what it says in the, haha, Debbie is jumping in. Please, Debbie. Do we have an answer? Debbie, are you muted?
Sorry, I was muted.
There we go.
If you're not making any changes to the MARC record other than in the 900 fields, which are local information fields, and that you do not need to put the GRMLC in the 040. If you're editing the record at all other than the 900 fields, then you do need to add another subfield D.
Perfect.
So if it auto-populates when you download?
No. If you're using a Cat Express record, when you download that, it autofills your specific Cat Express code. And that's fine. You don't need to add GRMLC to that if it's got your library code. In the 003, you would want to use the VTLIB if it's blank. That will autofill if you click in it.
Okay.
And just for any vocal libraries, people don't understand the codes, but it's capital V, small t for Vermont, capital M, small I for Middlebury, and then GML. Middlebury is because Chris Kirby's the one that applied for that code for us, and he's in Middlebury.
Oh, cool.
So
Okay.
it has nothing to do with where vocal is based or anything other than the fact that that's where Chris Kirby was when he applied for the code.
Awesome.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to use this opportunity to make a plug for the cataloging roundtable, because I hope that what just happened here can get going on a monthly basis. We can bring our questions and have, you know, different representatives, you know, hearing what other people are doing in maybe different consortiums or just at different libraries. So thanks everyone for just jumping in there. I think I saw another hand earlier. It's not raised now. What is the cataloging roundtable? Andrea, thank you for asking. So at the end of the month, on the last Tuesday of every month, depending on availability, if that works for people, from 10 to 11:30, we're basically going to do similar to the ILL roundtable, where I can put together an agenda if people have specific items that we want catalogers to come together and discuss, talk about successes, talk about either issues that are coming up or, you know, larger cataloging conversations that are happening in library world. It would be nice to get just like a Vermont hub where we can discuss cataloging issues or successes or really whatever catalogers in the state want to talk about. I think it'd be really nice resource sharing opportunity, because I think there's so much knowledge and people are figuring out things day to day that, you know, should be shared with the greater Vermont cataloging community. There is information about that on the VTLIB website, Vermont Department of Libraries website, under the technical services area and the learn more about cataloging page, which I think there's a link to that in the syllabus. And I tried to send out the syllabus and these slides before class today. I'll send them out again after class to make sure everyone gets them. Yeah, so that's the cataloging roundtable. All right, how are we doing? Okay. I'm gonna keep on rolling. So that is, oh, thank you, Josh, for putting that in there. That is a bunch on this 040 field. Okay, language code. Codes for languages associated with an item. When the language code in our fixed elements description field or the 3537 of the record is insufficient to convey full information, includes records for multilingual items, which I think, you know, some of those items are starting to pop up in Vermont, items that involve translation and items where the medium of communication is sign language, which probably pretty rare, but interesting that, you know, there's a space for that. Here's a link for these MARC code list for languages. You know, typically we're going to see a lot of English. If something's in English, you don't need to add it. But I thought that this was worth pointing out because, you know, more and more we're getting conversations, or at least I'm hearing conversations about material that is in other language, or some libraries have taken it upon themselves to get picture books and, you know, annotate a translation for multilingual story time, which I think is fantastic. And there is a place, oh gosh, sorry. There is a place to record these item, that facet of the item in the MARC. And so you can add, you know, additional language codes here in this field. You can state if it's a translation in the indicator, and the second indicator. Typically, I would say use the MARC language codes at this link, and then that can stay blank. But if there is some other source that you're going to use, make sure you put it in subfield 2 and have the second indicator as a 7. Let's see, do we have an example? Yeah, bunch of examples. So here we have text is in English, but it was translated from French, notated in the record in this 41 field. Here again, text is in an English translation of a German text, which was originally published in Swedish. Once again, these are fields that are not always going to be present, and if it, isn't really applicable to your catalog and your collection, don't get caught up too much in it. Text in original Greek and in English translation. So these multilingual items might be becoming more relevant to some libraries. No information provided. Oh, this is talking about the different indicators that will be present. The item includes text in English, French, and Swedish. It's going to appear this way with the different languages listed out. Notice that that A field is repeatable, and both indicators are null. Language code of captions. Sometimes you'll see this on DVD or video recording records. It just lists that there are closed captions in English or, other languages. So that might be a field that might come up. 246, varying form of title, appearing on different parts of the item or a portion of the title proper, or an alternative form of the title when the form differs substantially from the title statement in 245, and if they contribute to the further identification of the item. So typically we see a lot of no note added entry for this first indicator. The second indicator is typically null because we're not specifying like what type of title or from where in the title this varying form is coming from. And then it's listed in subfield A. An example. All right, so this is just further clarification of the title, African Seminar Series. Here we have an abbreviation of Bangladesh Education Extension Center. And once again, this is another varying form of that with the periods in between. This is probably the most common form that I see with the 246 being used, is that instead of the ampersand, we're spelling out and. An ampersand was probably used on the title page, but in order to, still have this as a result popping up if someone spells out and, just covering the base of including that as a potential variant. Edition statement can be a really important aspect to a MARC record, especially if you have several editions of something. Its indicators are both null, and typically you only see the subfield A filled out with, spelled out first edition. This is a quick way, especially if you're doing copy cataloging, and if you know what edition you have, that can be a really nice place to look. So you can make it easier for someone else if you are the one cataloging this, or it's a good place to look. Third edition, Canadian edition, whatever statement may be present on the title page can be included here, and the statement is spelled out. This is what it looks like in Verso, of course. All right, a little bit trickier now. It's the 490. So this is for a series statement for a series title. And when the field 490 is used, a series added entry is desired. Both the series statement, 490, and a corresponding series added entry, depending on what way the series is appearing, you use fields 800 through 830. They're recorded in the bibliographic record. All right, so typically the first indicator is a 1. It's a series that is being traced. The second indicator is null. Your series statement goes in the A subfield, and subfield V is noting what volume typically. Now, if that's present, you should also have an 800 or an 830 present, talking about, okay, so this series, if it's done by one singular author, their personal name gets tracked as well with this. Or if it's just the title, so if there's a series that has multiple authors, an 830 series added entry works as well. So here are some examples of that. So we have our 490, it's a series title, it's Magic Tree House, there is a volume. Now this is the 800, it's linked by this author, Mary Pope Osborne. So I think recently there has been another author contributing to that. I may be wrong on that. But here are some other examples here of the James Joyce archive. It really has one author, James Joyce, and the title here is repeated again, James Joyce Archive. And then here is a series of Musica de Camera. This is volume 72. And typically the titles of these come from Oxford University Press. That's noted in the 830. As opposed to an 800 because there might be different authors of each volume. There's a question, what does it mean by series traced or series not traced? I'm going to pull up our MARC 21 because I want to get the language right on this. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. All right, let me share. Nope, that was the wrong screen. Sorry about that. Let's try this again. Window, the MARC 21 format. All right, so our first indicator, series tracing policy. Series tracing policy. Whether the series has no corresponding added entry, it's not traced, or has a corresponding, there we go. So if it has a corresponding 800 series added entry field, then it is traced. When volume 1 is used, the appropriate field is included in the bibliographic record to provide series added entry. So it has to do with whether or not those 800 fields are also included, which typically we will want to include those. All right, let's get back here. How are we doing on time? 10:55. All right, let's see. There are more questions in the chat. Is there a reason to fill out one or the other or both 400 and 800s? Not really sure how the 490 and the 800 fields differ and why they're both needed. What am I missing? So let's see here. When it comes to the series title, you want to include it because that way in your cataloging system, in your ILS, these materials can be linked really by their series. And series title doesn't really have a lot of information about the series itself. It has the information about what volume in the series. So like the 39 and the 11 are really important in this field when talking about the series itself. But then in the 800s, you have the additional information about the series. So this is like clarifying that this series by this author, this volume, where the 490 in this case is more about this is volume 11 in this series. So these are, you know, forms where you can specifically tie these data points together in different ways. I mean, typically in the past, I have seen records that only have, you know, 490 and maybe not the 800. But it's good to have both so that you can get this data linked, you know, making the most of the fact that we live in this digital age where now you can click on, you know, one thing that will bring up everything related. Hope that clarified. So this example is indicating that this particular book is the 39th volume in the Magic Treehouse overarching series, but number 11 of the subseries Merlin Missions. Yes. Someone brings up another example saying Robert Parker, he has several series and authors continuing them. That would be interesting to check into. Yeah, Ruth, I don't know if Robert Parker would always be in that 800. That would be something good to look into. Susan follows up saying, doesn't it link well enough by just using the 800 field? Yeah, the 800 field definitely does have more information. This is where I am wondering about the way that different ILS presents information. Some fields get presented and linked differently in different ILS systems. So that could come into play with having both of these fields filled out. Yeah, someone else is echoing that. Paige says it seems that 800 has all of the information of the 490 and more. Why keep the 490? That's a good question. It may come, you know, I don't have the exact answer off the top of my head at the moment, but may come back to cataloging rules. And I think the 400s might be more AACR2, but I don't want to state that as fact. But yeah, search functions might come into play as well. That's a good point, Susan. Julie's asking, so if an author passes and the publisher continues the series and uses another author, that new author would be in the 800. No, this is one of those times where instead of using the 800 pointing out the specific personal name, you would want to use the 830 talking about the series itself without bringing that personal name. Yeah, so it's either like 800 if there's always a specific person, although I don't know what happens off the top of my head with an example where there's like now, you know, someone who has taken over that. That's a good question. Definitely one of those, you know, what do I do if situations. But yeah, the 830 seems like it has the same information as the 490, but really the way that they're linked and the way that ILS tracks these things and indexes these things can differ. So generally, it's good practice to have both of these things, even though they're linked and may seem redundant. BC Andrews might be a good example of this. Worth looking into. All right, so we're going to move into 500s. The 500 field is a general note, general information, and we'll look at an example in a minute here. But this this might be serve us better when we're cataloging non-traditional items, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks. But I also wanted to note, this was a last minute addition that I thought of, 586 can be for awards. So that might be good to know for our Red Clover, Golden Dome, Green Mountain Book Award books. These highlights should be in the proper place, but the indicators are null in both of these in this field. And then typically you just have your general note in the A. So here's some examples of what general notes could be. This is obviously about an art piece. It's recast in bronze from another artist, plaster of original 1903. Interestingly enough, this person has put translated from German as a note. The caption title, so stating something about the title. Program notes by Philip Ramey on album, clarifying what the item is. Also formerly known as the unidentified soldier. So there's a lot of different ways that your 500 general note field can be used. If there's information that would be important to know about, that's where that information can kind of just be written out so that it's on the item. This differs from the 505 formatted contents note. Typically, these things come from the table of contents. You can include that in a record. So your first indicator is a 0. That means it is the contents of the book. It is just level of content designation. It's the basic level of content designation as typically what you're going to see. You just have the formatted contents note. Here's an example of this. So part 1 is about carbon. And notice that in between there are 2 hyphens to separate each kind of like title almost, I guess, is a fine word to use. How these records were discovered, a short sketch of the Talmuds, Constantine's letter. Notice that both of these examples, I believe, are from nonfiction. It's another way to search an item to learn if you want to use it, and there's a place for that in the MARC record. Okay, moving into the 600s, which we didn't really talk about last week in too much detail other than the 650. We did talk about this in the intro course a little bit. But so if you have a personal name present in the item, once again, the 600 fields have to do with the subject, not the author or the corporate name. And you can use the Library of Congress name authorities in order to get the proper, proper titles for the name or dates associated, the way that a name should appear. And if you don't use the Library of Congress subject headings name authority, you're going to put 7 in the second indicator and spell out your source of the heading. So we'll talk more about kind of using these other sources next week when we talk about subject headings in more depth and different controlled vocabularies. But it's worth noting that, typically a lot of libraries use Library of Congress subject headings and name authority because it's easy to use, pretty agreed upon. Here's the link there for that. So here's our Verso record, and both of these names appear in this book, and they are subjects of the material. And using the V subfield, we're still noting that, yes, they appear, yes, they were real people, this is when they lived, but they are being used in a fictional way. Geographic name can also work similarly. This is, if it's pertaining to, and when it comes to subject headings in general, there's a good rule that at least 20% like this subject is kind of relevant if we think about it in a percentage way, kind of 20% of the material at least pertains to this subject. So that's kind of how you can make a decision about what to include. And we'll talk more about that next week in a little bit more depth. Here are some examples, and really these other subfields within this field are just getting more and more specific. Now, I will say that a lot of the times when you do get more specific, in some ways, depending on the ILS, you can limit how easily it's pulled up. So generally, you kind of have to make that judgment call of, okay, how specific do we need to be here? What does the item really reflect? What would someone looking for it be after? But the good thing about these fields is that it's all repeatable and you can really add as many broad or specific as you would like. Oh, and that's also off, but here we can see that this is Cheyenne, Wyoming. It talks about social life and customs during the 19th century, still fiction. Here are some nonfiction examples. History of the Great War from 1843 to 1852 in Uruguay. Genre can also be represented in MARC records in the 655 field. And once again, these also do have Library of Congress subject heading genre/form terms that have been agreed upon, and controls vocabulary, links things together, gets rid of synonyms. We'll talk about that at length next week. But these are also searchable within the database, and you can state your genre. These are really only applicable if you're using a source that's not Library of Congress or one of the other ones listed here. Here's an example, and once again, you can see there are 4 of these. So it's really up to the cataloger, depending on time and ability, to add either as much information or really as little as one feels necessary. And if we notice, these are from a different source, but this is the Library of Congress genre form terms controlled vocabulary. So yeah. Wow, okay, so got through the main MARC fields that I wanted to get through today. Love to just open it up for general questions or about any specific fields that we need more clarification about. I can stop sharing. That way we can get Teams environment. How's everybody doing? Eric, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm doing well. Yeah. And maybe this is a question for next week with the 600s, but I'm just curious, how much does like one field capture? Like in the example with something being set in Wyoming, and then you have sort of the sub designations of it being such and such in Wyoming. Should it be separated out of like this is set in Wyoming, and then have a separate thing of this is mystery set in Wyoming, kind of that thing? Or is it okay to have it be it's set in Wyoming, it's a mystery, and it's this and this and this?
Yeah, so I
think make sense?
Yeah, there's a couple of things to consider, and one of them is how are things going to get indexed in your ILS? So if you only have, oh, this is not, yeah, this is fine. If you only have Cheyenne, Wyoming as a subject code, one only has to search for Cheyenne. Wyoming, and it'll come up. You know, we'll talk about this next week. There are some problems in making sure that you know, the user would be able to know to put in Cheyenne, Wyoming in the proper way in order for things to index and pull up. So it comes down to your ILS, and it also comes down to, you know, realistically, time constraints. How many times do you really want to repeat the 651 field if you want to put in Cheyenne, Wyoming, social life and customs, but also Cheyenne, Wyoming by itself, or maybe Cheyenne, Wyoming 19th century, or just Cheyenne, Wyoming fiction. These are the kind of judgment calls that there aren't clear answers about, yes, always do this, but there is, you know, guidelines for if you want to be specific and granular, you can. So I don't have, you know, the always do this. I think with a shared catalog, there's also something to consider in terms of, you know, just because maybe your library users are more likely to be really specific or granular or not. If you're in a shared catalog, you probably don't want to be making, you know, the most granular decisions because you're not the only one using that record. So that's another consideration. So there's a lot of things to weigh when it comes to, okay, how much do I include or what can I not include? So how does your ILS pull things together? But also, you know, the 650 fields in general are really nice, or the 600s, so that things are linked. Things are linked specifically. If you have somebody who's really into the history of the Great War of Uruguay, you can, you know, make it so that that is linked. And if you have consistently cataloged MARC records, if they click that, all of those with that same exact tag is going to show up. So that might be a pro to go granular. But it's really about, you know, what's going to be the most helpful and best use of your time as the cataloger, which there is not always a yes or no answer to that.
Well, that's still very
Hope
helpful.
that
Thank
helped.
you. No, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely invite everybody to come next week where we talk more about controlled vocabulary and some of its shortcomings and some of its happy things and beneficial aspects to that. Hopefully, you know, original cataloging can be quite time consuming and present a lot of questions about how best. Hopefully, you know, there are enough good records that you feel comfortable adding to so you can do, you know, better copy cataloging. But if questions come up, MARC 21 handbook is always my go-to. Or really, I'm also here to consult. Please send me a message. You know, even silly questions are fine. Happy to do that. Let me see where we're at with my presentation. I'm not seeing too many more questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So I do want to plug the events for the rest of the month. Next Wednesday, the same time, same link, same place. Come learn about, discuss current events, best practices when it comes to subject headings and library catalog. And then the following Wednesday, the last Wednesday of the month, from same time, same place, cataloging non-traditional materials. You know, more and more libraries are getting library of things, and with that comes the question, well, how do I catalog this? So I would love for people to bring examples, and we can discuss best practices, some successes, some helpful hints. I see that Patty has a question. I'd love to get your question, Patty.
Hi. My library uses library thing.
Okay.
The library used Kohat, and
Yep.
so I think it's different. But one of the questions I have about that is, if I scan the item that I'm cataloging, use the scanner on the ISBN code, rather than type in the title.
Yeah.
I often get incorrect information, like it'll say it's a paperback book when it's a hardcover. So I have to remember to check that, but I don't know if that's something you come across. Is it something that? Because I would think that the ISBN code would have all the correct information.
Yeah. So generally you want to have one record for one ISBN. But unfortunately, that's not always the case, and it is a repeatable field. So sometimes, it gets repeated. And I often see the ebook ISBN also included on the same record as, a physical hardcover copy with its ISBN, which I always ask myself, why is this like this? Especially when these are, seriously different formats. So it's one of those things where it's unfortunate, but when you're doing your own cataloging, it's important to remember, one item, one record. The best thing to do is to be able to know to check the 020 field. Typically the Q subfield in 020 states whether it's paperback, hardcover, hardback, ebook. And so, the best advice for that situation I have is just make sure you're checking there. And if I don't think Library World, you're just your own library, right? Is that considered a shared catalog? I don't think Library World is.
You mean Library Thing?
Yeah, Library Thing, sorry.
I thought it was considered a shared catalog because there's already, it's not just our information that's in Library Thing.
Okay. So,
because I could search for our books or for the same book in the whole catalog that we might not necessarily have that book.
Okay, but you don't have other libraries adding their items to the same record that your items are on, correct?
I don't think so, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Okay. Well, if you are in that situation where you have a catalog that maybe shares records or reaches out with a Z3950 search, but you're pulling in records, and if you're solely adding your items to a record, you do have that freedom to take away ISBN numbers that don't reflect the item that you have in hand. But if you are in a shared catalog, I would shy away from deleting things from MARC records unless, you're the only one to, like if you're pulling in that record, like if you're the first one to pull in a record and you want to make sure that it's solely the paperback reflected in that record. But if you're in a shared catalog, the rules definitely change a little bit as to what best practice is. But typically one ISBN, one set of ISBN numbers, the 10 and the 13 can be reflected, but you want one item, one set of ISBN, one record for one material.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, I saw a question in the chat about the link for the roundtable, which, every last Tuesday of every month, we're kind of piloting it now. The link for that is on the website, the technical services page of the Vermont Department of Libraries website, which should be linked on the syllabus, which I'll send out again. yeah, that link is there. And I've been enjoying saying to myself that we may use different ILS, but we can still share what's happening in our Vermont cataloging community. So I'm happy if you have specific things you would like to talk about, please send me agenda items. That way we can kind of plan out what our roadmap might be, or if there are specific topics. There is another question / comment that Jill is saying that in Catamount Library Network, which uses Koha, attempting to have a better catalog for patron experience, we try to have one record with multiple copies attached. We have rules and workshops for continuing ed. This works pretty well. Yeah, that's perfect. Whatever the rules of your consortium are, you want to adhere to them if you are a participating library. Jill continues saying, we added Aspen to Koha for our patron OPAC. Yep, this will show all the copies of a title available for the patrons. Yeah. Oh, I think I skipped Julie's question. Let me make sure. But thank you, Jill, for pointing out that having one record with multiple copies attached, really reflects the needs of the user. Jill, did I miss? No, Julie, I missed. You mentioned that 586 field can be used for awards. Can it also be applicable to items purchased via a specific grant, or would that be better suited to the 690 fields? That's a great question. My initial thought, I would not put that information in the 586 field. I would initially think to put it in the 500, but let me see the 690, and I see that there are hands up, and we have Debbie and Patty. I don't know who raised first. Patty has put her hand down. Debbie still has hers up. Debbie, do you want to jump in?
If you're part of a consortium, that information should not go in the MARC record. You should put it in your item, your specific item, because not every library in your consortium had a purchase with grant money for that material.
Oh, true. Yeah, the grant money. Yeah.
If you're a standalone, then it's a different story.
Yeah, that's great. That is great. A point. Yeah, we want to think about whether information should go on the MARC level in general, especially if you have a shared catalog, versus what should really just go on that item at your specific library. Thank you for that clarification, Debbie. That's a really important point. What was I just looking up? I was looking up new message. Maybe 952X for a grant purchase field. Potentially, yeah. I think Debbie raises a really good point, though, about questioning whether or not something, needs to be on that level, which level is more appropriate, and which, yeah, where that item or where that information about that item should go, who it's for, really. But yeah, the 900s are all very local specific, so that potentially could be, but in the case of grant money, yeah, it won't be applicable even for the library in the next town over. So good considerations. And yeah, it might be specific to our ILS. Yeah, the way that information shows up may not always be the same. Oh, that's what I was looking up, the 690 field as an example. I think we answered that question. Oh yeah, local subject access fields. It probably doesn't need to go on the record label or on the record level in that specific question. I will just say that there is a survey for feedback that will take 2 minutes, but is very helpful to us as a department and me specifically, to know what I can do, better to help things be more clear. But we have 4 minutes. I see there's a couple of questions. I'm going to stop sharing, but thanks everyone. Okay. Wouldn't you put the grant info into the specific item and not the record? Yep. Thank you, Jill. Oh, Laura asks, could you put the survey link in the chat? Yeah, that should be easy enough. Let me get out of presentation mode. Yeah, it's also on Niche Academy, which once this is... Oh, thank you, Andy, for jumping right on that. Yeah, it'll also be on Niche Academy where I will put this recording, and last week's is already up. Sorry for the delay on that. And next 2 weeks, next 2 sessions will also be on there. That also has the syllabus and the slides, all the information presented. And I'll probably send out a follow-up email just with that kind of stuff anyway. Let's see, is there anything else that I need to mention? I don't think so. I'm happy to hang out for the next 3 minutes, or if people feel like they got what they needed or, are content for now, please feel free to log off, but I hope to see you again, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me for today's session. Thanks, everybody.